Welcome to the Battleground Chronicles World War II channel. Subscribe to our channel because every day we publish stories about the valor of American soldiers based on real events. Support us. Like our videos if you like what we do for you. November 2nd, 1944. Dawn breaks reluctantly over the Hürtgen Forest on the German-Belgian border. A thick blanket of mist hovers between the towering fir trees, obscuring vision beyond 10 yards. The forest floor is a treacherous morass of mud, rotting leaves, and hidden dangers. The air carries the pungent smell of wet earth, decaying vegetation, and the lingering scent of cordite from artillery barrages. The men of the 28th Infantry Division, known as the Keystone Division, for the red keystone shoulder patch that proudly adorned their uniforms, stand in formation. These Pennsylvania National Guardsmen have already endured the Normandy invasion, fought through France, marched triumphantly through Paris, and breached the Siegfried Line. Their commanding officer, Major General Norman Dutch Coda, studies the terrain map before him, his weathered face betraying concern. The orders from First Army's commander, Lieutenant General Courtney Hodges, are explicit and troubling. The 28th Division must launch a three-pronged attack through the forest to capture the German town of Schmidt. Captain James Condon of the 112th Infantry Regiment swallows hard as he surveys the dark woods before him. Intelligence reports indicate the forest is heavily defended with concrete bunkers, machine gun nests, and extensive minefields. The ground itself is an enemy, muddy, uneven, densely wooded, with ravines and steep inclines. Above, the dense canopy will render American air support virtually useless. Artillery shells will explode in the treetops, sending deadly wooden splinters alongside metal shrapnel. "We're being sent into a meat grinder," whispers Lieutenant Frank Ripperdam to his fellow officer. Neither man knows how prophetic these words will prove to be. In the coming days, the 28th Infantry Division will endure one of the most brutal battles in American military history, a battle that military historian Charles McDonald would later describe as a misconceived and basically fruitless battle that could have, and should have, been avoided. This is not a tale of supernatural horrors or fictional monsters. This is the documented account of real men who endured a very real hell, a dark, blood-soaked forest where 33,000 Americans would become casualties in a battle largely forgotten by history. September 19, 1944. The first American troops entered the Hürtgen Forest. Elements of Brigadier General Maurice Rose's 3rd Armored Division probed cautiously into the dense woods, following orders from the 1st U.S. Army Command. Intelligence reports suggested that the Germans were withdrawing and that the forest could be taken with minimal resistance. The reports were catastrophically wrong. Inside the forest, General Oberst Walter Model, the commander of German Army Group B, had recognized the defensive potential of the terrain. Under his direction, German forces transformed the natural obstacle of the forest into an impenetrable fortress. Concrete bunkers from the Siegfried Line were reinforced. New pillboxes were constructed. Machine gun nests were positioned at key choke points. Anti-personnel and anti-tank mines were laid in great numbers. Artillery was pre-sighted on likely avenues of approach. The advancing Americans found themselves in a nightmare. Tanks and vehicles were confined to narrow, muddy forest roads, perfect killing zones for German anti-tank weapons. Infantry soldiers, separated from their armored support, stumbled through thick underbrush where visibility was limited to mere yards. German snipers, hidden in trees and camouflaged positions, picked off officers and radio operators. Artillery shells, directed with deadly precision by forward observers, exploded in the treetops, creating lethal tree bursts that rained shrapnel downward onto soldiers who had no protection. By October 16, the 9th Infantry Division had gained just 3,000 yards at the staggering cost of 4,500 casualties. The division was combat ineffective, its men physically and mentally exhausted from weeks of brutal fighting in conditions that one survivor described as a green hell. First Army Commander Lieutenant General Courtney Hodges faced a decision. Logic dictated withdrawal from the forest to seek another route. Instead, Hodges chose to double down. The 28th Infantry Division was ordered forward to relieve the battered 9th Division. Major General Norman Dutch Coda, commander of the 28th, protested the orders. Coda, a D-Day hero who had personally led men off the beach at Normandy, recognized the impossible nature of the task. The plan was essentially the same that had failed for the 9th Division. His protests were dismissed. The 28th would attack according to plan. The weary veterans of the 28th, who had fought across France and into Germany, trudged toward their new assignment. They had no way of knowing that they were marching toward what would be called the Death Factory and the Meat Grinder, a battle that would claim thousands of their comrades and leave an indelible mark on all who survived. The 28th Infantry Division had a proud lineage dating back to 1747, making it the oldest division-sized unit in the United States Army. Originally formed as Pennsylvania militia units, the division had seen action in the Spanish-American War and World War I. When the United States entered World War II, the 28th was federalized and began intensive training. By November 1944, the division was a battle-hardened unit. It had landed in Normandy in July 1944, fought through the hedgerows, and participated in the liberation of Paris. The division was among the first American units to enter Germany, crossing the border in September 1944. The division consisted of 3 infantry regiments, the 109th, 110th, and 112th, along with supporting artillery, engineer, and medical units. Each regiment had approximately 3,000 men, organized into battalions and companies. Major General Norman D. Coda commanded the division. Coda had distinguished himself on D-Day, personally leading troops off Omaha Beach while under intense German fire. His courage and leadership had earned him the respect of his men and his superiors alike. But even Coda's leadership could not overcome the challenges that awaited the division in the Hürtgen Forest. The plan handed down from 1st Army Headquarters called for a 3-pronged attack. The 109th Infantry Regiment would attack northward toward the town of Hürtgen. The 110th Infantry Regiment would advance eastward toward Siemensgall. The 112th Infantry Regiment would attack southeastward, crossing the Kahl River Gorge to capture the towns of Kammerscheid and Schmidt. The plan dispersed the division's strength, preventing concentration of force at any single point. Worse, it committed the division to fighting in terrain that heavily favored the defenders. On October 26, 1944, the 28th Division began moving into position, relieving elements of the battered 9th Division. Veterans of the 9th offered ominous warnings. "You guys are in for hell," said one sergeant from the 39th Infantry. "This forest, it eats divisions." Captain Robert Gaynor of the 112th Infantry recalled years later, "We knew we were in for a tough fight. The men from the 9th looked shell-shocked, but none of us imagined how bad it would actually be." As the 28th took up its positions, German observers carefully noted their movements. Field Marshal Model ordered reinforcements to the area. The 89th Infantry Division and elements of the 116th Panzer Division moved into defensive positions. Additional artillery was brought forward. The trap was set. The Americans would attack on November 2, 1944. They would step into a nightmare beyond their darkest imaginings. November 2, 1944. 0800 hours. A massive artillery barrage marked the beginning of the 28th Division's attack into the Hürtgen Forest. Thousands of shells crashed into German positions, splitting the morning air with thunderous explosions. Tree bursts sent showers of splinters and shrapnel raining down. The earth trembled. Smoke and dust billowed through the forest. When the barrage lifted, the men of the 28th Division moved forward. The horror began immediately. The 109th Infantry Regiment, tasked with capturing the town of Hürtgen, advanced less than 300 yards before encountering disaster. Their path led directly into an extensive, unreported German minefield. The Germans had named it Wild Sow, Wild Pig, and it stretched for approximately 150 meters in width and nearly a kilometer in length in front of Hürtgen town. "We were walking in a column when the first explosion came," recalled Sergeant William Martinez of Charlie Company. A man from 1st Platoon stepped on something, and suddenly his leg was just gone. Then another explosion, and another. Men were screaming. We tried to back out, but then the mortars started falling. The Germans had pre-sighted their mortars and machine guns on the minefield. As soon as the Americans entered it, they opened fire. Men trapped in the minefield were cut down by machine gun fire or blown apart by mortar shells. Those who survived the initial onslaught found themselves pinned down, unable to advance or retreat. "The mines were everywhere," wrote Lieutenant Howard Reed in his official after-action report. S-mines, SCU mines, teller mines. Some were buried in the mud. Others were attached to tripwires. Every movement risked detonation. By nightfall, the 109th had gained only 800 yards at the cost of hundreds of casualties. They dug in under continued German artillery fire, each man huddled in his foxhole as shells exploded around them, and tree bursts sent deadly wooden splinters slicing through the darkness. Meanwhile, the 110th Infantry Regiment advanced toward Siemensskal, encountering similarly fierce resistance. German machine gun positions, concealed in the dense forest and protected by mines and barbed wire, opened fire on the advancing Americans. The narrow forest trails channeled the American troops into killing zones where German gunners had clear fields of fire. "You couldn't see them," remembered Private First Class Anthony DeMarco. "You'd be moving forward, and suddenly the man in front of you would jerk and fall. Then another. Machine gun fire was coming from somewhere, but in that forest, with echoes bouncing off trees, you couldn't tell where. Men were dying and we couldn't even see who was killing them. The 110th gained little ground, suffering heavy casualties from both enemy fire and the treacherous terrain. Men slipped down steep, muddy slopes, breaking ankles and legs. Others became separated from their units in the dense forest, wandering alone until they either reunited with American forces or encountered German patrols. Only the 112th Infantry Regiment made significant progress on that first day. They captured the town of Wassenack, which sat on a ridge overlooking the Kahl River Gorge. From this position, they could see their ultimate objective, the town of Schmidt, situated on another ridge across the gorge. But taking Wassenack was just the beginning. To reach Schmidt, they would have to descend a steep slope, cross the Kahl River, then climb another steep slope, all while under enemy fire, in territory laced with mines and booby traps. As night fell on November 2nd, the men of the 28th Division dug their foxholes and tried to rest. Many would never see another dawn. German artillery continued to pound American positions throughout the night, sending deadly tree bursts raining down on men who had no protection from above. The temperature dropped, and a cold rain began to fall, soaking men who were already exhausted from a day of combat. The horror of the Hürtgen Forest was just beginning. November 3, 1944. As dawn broke over the forest, the men of the 112th Infantry Regiment prepared to advance from Wassenack toward their objective, the town of Schmidt. To reach Schmidt, they would need to descend into the Kahl River Gorge, cross the river, and climb the far slope, all under enemy fire. The only route across the gorge was a narrow, muddy forest path that came to be known as the Kahl Trail. This trail would become the scene of some of the most horrific fighting in the entire battle. Lieutenant Colonel Carl Peterson, commander of the 1st Battalion, 112th Infantry, gathered his company commanders for a briefing before the advance. "The engineers say the trail is passable for jeeps and light vehicles," Peterson informed them, relying on intelligence that would soon prove catastrophically wrong. "We'll move across in column, secure the far side, then bring up armor support." Captain James Condon of Alpha Company had misgivings. "Sir, has anyone actually reconnoitered this trail?" "There wasn't time," Peterson admitted, "but according to the maps, it's our best option." The advance began at 0900 hours. Alpha and Bravo companies led the way, moving cautiously down the steep, muddy slope toward the Kahl River. The men slipped and stumbled on the treacherous terrain. The narrow trail, barely wide enough for a single jeep, wound through dense forest where visibility was limited to a few yards. "It was like descending into hell," recalled Sergeant Frank Ripperdam. The trail was nothing but mud, sometimes knee-deep. Men were falling, equipment was being lost, and all the while, we knew the Germans were out there, watching. German snipers and machine gunners, positioned on the slopes above the trail, opened fire sporadically. Men fell without warning, shot by enemies they could not see. Despite the casualties, the lead elements reached the Kahl River around noon. The river itself was not large, perhaps 20 feet across and 3 feet deep at its center. But its banks were steep and slippery, and crossing it meant exposure to German fire. One by one, the men of Alpha Company waded across, the cold waters soaking them to the waist. Once across, they quickly established defensive positions, while Bravo Company followed. By mid-afternoon, both companies had crossed the river and begun climbing the far slope toward Kammerscheid, a small hamlet that lay between the Kahl River and Schmidt. German resistance increased as they climbed, with mortar and artillery fire raining down on the advancing Americans. Meanwhile, behind them, efforts were underway to improve the Kahl Trail to allow armor and supply vehicles to cross. Combat engineers worked frantically, filling holes, removing obstacles, and attempting to widen the narrowest sections. It was an impossible job, recalled Lieutenant Robert Higgins of the 20th Engineer Combat Battalion. The trail was never meant for military traffic. It was a logging path at best. The slopes were too steep, the curves too sharp, and the Germans had mined it extensively. The first American tanks attempted to navigate the trail late that afternoon. The lead Sherman tank made it less than halfway down the slope before sliding off the trail and becoming hopelessly stuck in the mud. The second tank tried to bypass it and hit a mine, its explosion echoing through the forest. As darkness fell on November 3, the situation was precarious. Elements of the 112th Infantry had reached Kammerscheid and even pushed forward to the outskirts of Schmidt. But their supply line, the tenuous Kahl Trail, was already proving inadequate. No armor had made it across to support them. Supplies could only be brought forward by men carrying them on their backs, and the Germans were preparing to counterattack. November 4, 1944. Dawn broke with a moment of hope for the men of the 112th Infantry. During the night, elements of the regiment had pushed forward and captured the town of Schmidt, the division's primary objective. The regimental commander, Colonel Guston Nelson, reported the success to division headquarters, where it was received with jubilation. But the German response was swift and devastating. Field Marshal Walter Model, the German commander, recognized the threat posed by the American capture of Schmidt. He immediately ordered a powerful counterattack, committing elements of the 116th Panzer Division with their formidable Panther and Tiger tanks. The Americans in Schmidt had no effective anti-tank weapons. The bazooka teams that had made it to the town found their weapons largely ineffective against the frontal armor of the German tanks. The few Sherman tanks that had managed to navigate the treacherous Kahl Trail were outgunned and out-armored by their German counterparts. They came out of the morning fog like monsters, remembered Corporal David Hartman of the 112th Infantry. 5, maybe 6 Panther tanks, with infantry between them. Our bazooka rounds just bounced off their front armor. They rolled right into town, crushing everything in their path. The American forces in Schmidt had no choice but to retreat. What began as an orderly withdrawal quickly deteriorated into chaos as German artillery and tank fire tore through the American ranks. Men fled back toward Kammerscheid, abandoning equipment and sometimes even wounded comrades in their desperation to escape. "I saw things that morning I can't forget," wrote Lieutenant William Bradford in a letter home weeks later. "Men running in blind panic, others frozen in place, unable to move, a medic trying to drag a wounded man to safety, both of them cut down by machine gun fire. It was slaughter." By noon, the Americans had been driven completely out of Schmidt. The survivors regrouped in Kammerscheid, where they prepared for the German attack they knew would come. Meanwhile, the situation on the Kahl Trail was deteriorating rapidly. German forces had infiltrated the area around the trail, ambushing supply parties and targeting the combat engineers who were desperately trying to improve the route. Snipers positioned in the dense forest picked off men one by one. Mortar teams zeroed in on the trail, making movement during daylight hours virtually suicidal. Major General Norman Cota, the division commander, was receiving increasingly desperate reports from the front. The 109th Infantry remained bogged down in front of Hürtgen, unable to advance through the extensive minefields. The 110th Infantry had made minimal progress towards Simonskal against fierce resistance. And now the 112th Infantry, which had briefly achieved its objective, was being driven back. Cota requested permission to adjust his plan, to concentrate his forces rather than continuing the three-pronged attack that was clearly failing. Lieutenant General Hodges at 1st Army Headquarters refused. The original plan would continue. As night fell on November 4, the men of the 28th Division found themselves in an increasingly desperate situation. Supplies of ammunition, food, and medical materials were running critically low for the units across the Kahl River. Evacuation of wounded had become nearly impossible due to German control of the surrounding forest. Many injured men died on the Kahl Trail while being carried back to aid stations, their litter bearers picked off by snipers or caught in artillery barrages. The night brought little respite. German artillery continued to pound American positions, the shells exploding in the treetops and sending lethal fragments raining down on men huddled in shallow foxholes. The temperature dropped below freezing, adding the torment of the cold to the already unbearable conditions. Many men developed trench foot as they stood for hours in water-filled foxholes, their feet swelling and turning black with infection. In the command post of the 112th Infantry, Colonel Nelson received reports of German armor massing for an attack on Kammerscheid the following morning. He requested urgent anti-tank support. None was available. The men of the 28th Division were about to face the full fury of the German counterattack, alone and virtually unsupported. November 5, 1944. The German assault on Kammerscheid began at first light. Through the morning mist, the men of the 112th Infantry watched in horror as a line of Panther and Tiger tanks emerged from the forest edge, followed by waves of infantry. Captain James Condon, now commanding what remained of Alpha and Bravo companies combined, surveyed the approaching German force through his binoculars. "I count 10 tanks," he reported to battalion headquarters. "At least 2 companies of infantry with them. We need armor support immediately." The response was not encouraging. Tank Destroyer Battalion is trying to get across the Kahl. They're encountering heavy resistance. Hold your position as long as possible. The American soldiers in Kammerscheid prepared for the onslaught as best they could. Bazookas were positioned to hit the German tanks from the side or rear, where their armor was thinnest. Machine guns were sighted to cut down the advancing infantry. Every man checked his weapon and counted his remaining ammunition. The first German artillery barrage hit with devastating effect. Shells crashed into the American positions, collapsing buildings and burying men under rubble. The few American mortars returned fire, but they were vastly outgunned. Then the tanks came, their 75mm and 88mm guns firing directly into American positions. Buildings crumbled under the impact. Men died in groups as shells found their hiding places. "I was in the basement of a stone house with 8 other guys," recalled Private First Class Michael Donovan. A Tiger tank stopped right outside and fired its 88 directly into the wall. The whole side of the house collapsed. I was the only one who made it out. The American defense was heroic, but ultimately futile. A bazooka team managed to disable one Panther tank by hitting its track, immobilizing it. Another team scored a lucky hit on the turret ring of a Tiger, jamming its turret. But for every German tank damaged or destroyed, the Americans lost dozens of men. By mid-morning, German forces had penetrated the center of Kammerscheid. House-to-house fighting ensued, with American soldiers defending each building room by room. Medics worked frantically in makeshift aid stations, treating the wounded under constant fire. "We ran out of morphine by noon," remembered medic Walter Jensen. "Men were screaming in pain. We had nothing to give them. I held one kid's hand while Doc Harrison dug shrapnel out of his leg without anesthesia. The kid bit clean through his belt rather than scream." Around 1300 hours, the tide briefly turned. 3 American Sherman tanks, having somehow navigated the treacherous Kahl Trail, arrived in Kammerscheid. Their 75mm guns engaged the German tanks, providing momentary relief to the beleaguered infantry. But the reprieve was short-lived. The Sherman tanks, with their inferior armor and armament, were no match for the German Panthers and Tigers in direct combat. Within an hour, 2 of the 3 American tanks were burning wrecks. The third withdrew, its commander wisely recognizing the futility of the uneven battle. By late afternoon, the situation was untenable. Colonel Nelson, after consulting with General Koda, reluctantly gave the order to withdraw from Kammerscheid. The remaining American forces began a fighting retreat back toward the Kahl River. "It wasn't a retreat, it was a rout," wrote Lieutenant Frank Ripperdam in his diary. "Men were throwing away equipment to run faster. The Germans were right on our heels, machine gunning anyone who fell behind. I saw a sergeant shoot his own foot rather than go back into that hell. I couldn't blame him." The survivors reached the Kahl River as darkness fell. There, they established a defensive perimeter, determined to hold the river crossing at all costs. They dug foxholes in the rocky soil and prepared for the German attack they knew would come with dawn. That night, as sleet fell from a leaden sky, the men of the 112th Infantry faced the grim reality of their situation. They were cut off, low on ammunition, food, and medical supplies, with many wounded comrades who could not be evacuated. German forces surrounded them on 3 sides. Their only route of escape was the deadly Kahl Trail, now under constant German fire. It would be a long, terrible night. For many, it would be their last. While the men of the 112th Infantry fought for survival at the Kahl River crossing, the 109th Infantry continued its bloody struggle to capture the town of Hürtgen. Their path led through what became known as one of the most deadly minefields of the entire European campaign, the Wild Sow, Wild Pig. This extensive minefield, constructed by German engineers between November 7–11, was approximately 150 meters wide and stretched for nearly a kilometer in front of Hürtgen town. It contained an estimated 3,000 mines of various types, including anti-personnel shoe mines that exploded with the slightest pressure, S-mines, bouncing betties, that leapt to waist height before exploding to maximize casualties, and anti-tank teller mines capable of destroying vehicles. Lieutenant Colonel Daniel Strickler, commander of the 109th Infantry, received increasingly desperate reports from his forward companies as they attempted to navigate this deadly obstacle. "We're taking 70% casualties just trying to clear a path," reported Captain Michael Harris of Charlie Company. "The mines are laid in no pattern we can discern, and every time we try to work, the Germans hit us with mortars and machine gun fire." The combat engineers attached to the 109th worked heroically, probing the frozen ground inch by inch with bayonets to locate mines. Many paid with their lives or limbs for the slightest mistake. "I watched Sergeant Phillips step on something that didn't even click," recalled Engineer Corporal Thomas Wright. "One second he was there, the next there was just red mist where he had been. These shoe mines, they're devilish things. Wooden cases with just enough metal to make them work. Our mine detectors barely register them. Progress through the minefield was agonizingly slow. A company might spend an entire day clearing a path just 50 yards long, only to have German infiltrators reseed it with mines during the night. The Germans had thoroughly prepared their defense. Machine gun nests on the far side of the minefield had interlocking fields of fire, covering every possible approach. Mortars and artillery were pre-sighted on the field, ready to rain death on any Americans caught in the open. Snipers positioned in the surrounding forest picked off officers, radiomen, and engineers with chilling precision. "You couldn't raise your head without drawing fire," wrote Private First Class Anthony DeMarco in a letter home weeks later. "We spent 2 days in a hole that was half filled with icy water, unable to move, eat, or even relieve ourselves. The guy next to me got hit by a sniper while trying to use his canteen. Just rolled over, dead, still holding his water." By November 8th, the 109th Infantry had suffered over 500 casualties attempting to breach the Wild Pig minefield, with minimal territorial gains to show for the sacrifice. Men were reaching the breaking point, both physically and psychologically. I saw hardened veterans, men who had fought since Normandy, sitting in foxholes crying like babies, remembered medic Walter Jensen. Others just stared blankly, not responding when you spoke to them. We called it forest fatigue then. Today they'd call it acute combat stress reaction. The conditions exacerbated the psychological trauma. Constant moisture caused trench foot and immersion foot, painful conditions where the feet swell and the skin begins to rot. Men who couldn't walk had to be carried, further slowing the already glacial pace of the advance. Artillery tree bursts, shells exploding in the forest canopy, sent lethal fragments of metal and wood raining down on troops who had no overhead cover. The dense forest limited visibility to a few yards, creating a perpetual sense of claustrophobia and dread. Every shadow might conceal a German sniper or patrol. Every step might trigger a hidden mine. On November 9, in a particularly tragic incident, a platoon from Delta Company became disoriented in the forest and wandered into their own artillery fire. 17 men died before frantic radio calls halted the barrage. Despite the horrific casualties and minimal gains, Lieutenant General Hodges at 1st Army Headquarters continued to insist that the attack proceed according to plan. Major General Coda's requests to adjust the approach were repeatedly denied. By November 10th, the 109th Infantry had suffered nearly 50% casualties and was effectively combat ineffective. Yet they were ordered to continue the attack. The Wild Pig minefield had lived up to its name, devouring men and machines with voracious appetite. The battle for Hürtgen would continue, claiming ever more lives in what was increasingly recognized by the men fighting it as a senseless slaughter. As the battle entered its second week, conditions throughout the Hürtgen Forest deteriorated from nightmarish to apocalyptic. The weather turned bitterly cold, with freezing rain and sleet adding to the misery of men already pushed beyond their limits. The 110th Infantry Regiment, attacking eastward towards Simonskal, found themselves in what survivors would later call the death factory. German defenses in this sector were particularly well prepared, with concrete bunkers, extensive trench systems, and interlocking fields of fire that covered every approach. Captain Robert Gaynor led what remained of Bravo Company, 110th Infantry, as they attempted to capture a key road junction. His official after-action report provides a clinical description of the horror his men experienced. At 0645 hours, B Company attacked toward Objective Green with a strength of 96 men. Initial progress was approximately 200 yards before heavy machine gun fire from multiple positions halted the advance. Artillery support was called, but proved ineffective due to tree bursts causing friendly casualties. At 0930, a German counterattack supported by self-propelled guns forced a withdrawal to our starting positions. By 1200 hours, B Company's effective strength was reduced to 41 men. Of the 4 officers who began the attack, only the undersigned survived. The same pattern repeated throughout the forest. American units would attack, make minimal gains at terrible cost, then be forced back by determined German counterattacks. The 28th Division was being bled white. Medical personnel worked beyond exhaustion, trying to save the wounded under impossible conditions. Aid stations, set up in whatever shelter could be found, were overwhelmed with casualties. Evacuation routes were under constant German fire, making the movement of wounded men to field hospitals a deadly gamble. We ran out of plasma, then bandages, then morphine, recalled Captain Gerald Morton, a medical officer with the 103rd Medical Battalion. We were tearing up uniform shirts for bandages. Men died who might have been saved with proper equipment. And all the while, more wounded kept coming in. The psychological toll was as devastating as the physical. Men who had fought bravely through Normandy and across France broke down under the unrelenting stress of the forest battle. Cases of combat fatigue, what would later be recognized as post-traumatic stress disorder, skyrocketed. I found one kid hiding in a foxhole, thumb in his mouth, rocking back and forth, remembered Sergeant William Martinez. He couldn't speak, couldn't respond to his name, just stared with these wide, terrified eyes. We had to send him back, but I don't know if he ever made it. The evac route was pure hell. German tactics exploited the psychological pressure. They would infiltrate small units behind American lines during the night, setting up machine gun positions that would open fire on American rear areas at dawn. The constant threat of attack from any direction kept men in a state of perpetual fear and exhaustion. "You couldn't sleep," wrote Private First Class Michael Donovan in his diary. "Every sound in that forest might be the Germans sneaking up on you. Every shadow might be a sniper. After 3 days without real sleep, you start seeing things that aren't there. After 5 days, you're not sure what's real anymore." By November 11, the 28th Division had suffered over 3,000 casualties, a full quarter of its fighting strength, with minimal territorial gains to show for the sacrifice. Replacements arriving at the front were shocked by the condition of the veterans. "They looked like walking dead," recalled Private James Morrison, who arrived as a replacement on November 12th. Hollow eyes, filthy uniforms caked with mud and blood, many limping from trench foot. One guy just laughed when I asked where to report. "Welcome to hell, kid," he said. He was dead the next day. Yet despite the catastrophic losses and lack of progress, 1st Army Headquarters insisted that the attack continue. The 28th Division, already shattered by a week of brutal combat, was ordered to renew its efforts to capture Schmidt and Hürtgen. What followed would be among the most devastating days in the division's history. November 12-14, 1944. As the battle for the Hürtgen Forest entered its critical phase, the 28th Division was approaching its breaking point. The 3 infantry regiments had suffered crippling casualties. The supply situation was dire, with ammunition, food, and medical supplies running critically low. The weather had worsened, with temperatures dropping below freezing at night, causing additional casualties from exposure and frostbite. The 112th Infantry, having been driven from Schmidt and Kammerscheid, was desperately trying to maintain a defensive perimeter around the Kahl River crossing. Their situation was particularly precarious. German forces surrounded them on 3 sides, and their only supply route, the treacherous Kahl Trail, was under constant enemy fire. Lieutenant Colonel Karl Peterson, commander of the 1st Battalion, 112th Infantry, described the situation in a radio message to regimental headquarters. "Situation critical. Ammunition down to 10 rounds per man. Many wounded cannot be evacuated. German armor observed massing for attack. Request immediate reinforcement and resupply or authorization to withdraw." The response from Colonel Guston Nelson, the regimental commander, was terse. "Hold position at all costs. Reinforcements not available. Resupply attempted tonight." That night, a supply column attempted to navigate the Kahl Trail to bring desperately needed ammunition and medical supplies to the beleaguered troops at the river crossing. Led by Lieutenant Howard Reed, the column consisted of 10 jeeps loaded with supplies and escorted by a platoon of infantry. They never arrived. Halfway down the trail, the column was ambushed by German forces who had infiltrated the area during the day. Machine gun fire swept the narrow path, killing or wounding most of the escorts in the first minutes. 3 jeeps were destroyed by satchel charges thrown by German combat engineers. The survivors fought desperately, but were overwhelmed by superior numbers. Lieutenant Reed was captured along with several others. The supplies fell into German hands. Only 3 men managed to escape and make their way back to American lines to report the disaster. Meanwhile, the 109th Infantry continued its futile attempts to breach the Wild Pig minefield in front of Hürtgen. By November 13, they had suffered over 700 casualties in this effort alone. Combat engineers worked around the clock, probing the frozen ground inch by inch with bayonets, looking for the deadly shoe mines that conventional mine detectors couldn't locate reliably. "I watched a man step on a mine that took off his foot," recalled Sergeant Frank Ripperdam. "He fell forward onto another mine that took off his arm. He was still alive, screaming for help, when a 3rd mine finished him. We couldn't reach him. The whole area was seeded with the damn things." The 110th Infantry, attacking towards Simonskal, fared no better. German defenses in this sector were particularly strong, with multiple layers of bunkers, trenches, and minefields. The dense forest canopy continued to make American artillery largely ineffective, with many shells exploding in the treetops rather than reaching their targets. By November 14, the situation was untenable. Major General Cota, recognizing that his division was on the verge of complete destruction, sent an urgent message to Lieutenant General Hodges at 1st Army Headquarters. 28th Division combat effectiveness severely compromised. Casualties exceed 40% in all regiments. Supply situation critical. Weather deteriorating. Request permission to consolidate positions and cease offensive operations. After 3 days of deliberation, during which the 28th continued to suffer heavy casualties, Hodges finally agreed to suspend the offensive. The remnants of the 112th Infantry were withdrawn from their exposed position at the Kahl River. The 109th and 110th consolidated their lines, giving up most of the ground they had gained at such terrible cost. On November 16th, elements of the 8th Infantry Division began relieving the shattered 28th Division. Men who had entered the forest as part of a proud, battle-hardened unit emerged as hollow-eyed shadows of themselves. "I went in with 198 men in my company," said Captain James Condon during debriefing. "I came out with 37. And most of those should be in hospital, but they refused evacuation because they wouldn't abandon their comrades." The 28th Infantry Division had been effectively destroyed as a fighting force in just 2 weeks of combat in the Hürtgen Forest. It would be months before the division would be combat ready again, after receiving thousands of replacements and extensive retraining. But the battle for the Hürtgen Forest was far from over. The 8th Infantry Division, followed by the 4th Infantry Division, would be fed into the same meat grinder, suffering similar horrific casualties for minimal gains. The slaughter in the dark forest would continue until February 1945, claiming over 33,000 American casualties in one of the most costly and controversial battles of World War II. December 6, 1944. After the 28th Infantry Division's catastrophic losses, the battle for the Hürtgen Forest continued with new units being fed into the meat grinder. Among these was the legendary 2nd Ranger Battalion, the elite unit that had scaled the cliffs at Pointe du Hoc on D-Day. Their target was Hill 400, a critical observation point that overlooked much of the battlefield. From this commanding height, German artillery observers had been directing devastating fire on American positions throughout the forest. Taking Hill 400 would blind the German artillery and potentially break the stalemate. The Rangers' commander, Lieutenant Colonel James Earl Rudder, gathered his company officers for a briefing on December 5. The plan called for a surprise attack at dawn the following day. Companies D and F would lead the assault, with Companies A and B in support. "This will be no easy task," Rudder told them, his face grave. "The hill is heavily fortified. The Germans have had months to prepare their defenses. But we have surprise on our side, and we have the best damn soldiers in the U.S. Army." The Rangers moved into their jump-off positions during the night of December 5-6, advancing silently through the dark forest. The weather was bitterly cold, with temperatures well below freezing and a light snow falling. At 0730 hours on December 6, the attack began. Companies D and F, approximately 65 men in total, surged forward toward the base of Hill 400. German machine guns opened fire almost immediately, cutting down several Rangers in the first moments of the assault. But the Rangers pressed on, using Bangalore torpedoes to blast gaps in the barbed wire and concentrated fire to suppress the German positions. They reached the base of the hill and began to climb, moving from cover to cover as German fire intensified. "It was like climbing straight into hell," remembered Sergeant Samuel Fuller of F Company. "Machine gun fire everywhere, mortars falling all around us. Men were dropping left and right, but we kept going." That's what Rangers do. The Rangers reached the crest of Hill 400 after a 45-minute firefight, overrunning the German positions in fierce hand-to-hand combat. By 0830, they had secured the hill and established a defensive perimeter, capturing 10 German prisoners and several artillery observation posts. But holding the hill would prove even more challenging than taking it. The Germans, recognizing the critical importance of Hill 400, immediately began preparing a counterattack. Throughout the day, they subjected the Rangers to intense artillery bombardment, using their superior numbers to probe the American defenses from multiple directions. The first major counterattack came around noon, with approximately 200 German infantry, supported by self-propelled guns, attempting to retake the hill from the south. The Rangers, now down to fewer than 50 effective fighters, repelled this attack in desperate combat. "We were running low on everything: ammunition, medical supplies, water," recalled Lieutenant Jack Miller. "Men were using captured German weapons because they had run out of ammo for their own. The wounded who could still shoot were propped up against rocks, fighting alongside the able-bodied." A second, more powerful counterattack came in mid-afternoon. This time, the Germans committed elements of the elite 6th Parachute Regiment, attacking from the northwest with approximately 150 men. The fighting was at close quarters, sometimes hand-to-hand, as the Germans reached the Ranger positions. At the critical moment, when it seemed the Rangers might be overwhelmed, Sergeant Edward Secor grabbed 2 captured German machine pistols and charged directly into the attacking force, firing both weapons from the hip. His unexpected counterattack momentarily stunned the Germans, allowing the remaining Rangers to rally and drive back the attackers. By nightfall, the Rangers on Hill 400 had been reduced to just 25 combat-effective personnel. Casualties had been severe, with over half the original force killed or wounded. Ammunition was critically low, and many of the wounded could not be evacuated due to continued German fire on the approaches to the hill. Lieutenant Colonel Rudder requested urgent reinforcement. Company E, with just 35 men, was sent forward during the night to bolster the defenses. They arrived just in time to help repel a third German counterattack that began at dawn on December 7. This attack, launched in the half-light of early morning, nearly succeeded in overwhelming the Ranger positions. German infantry reached the American foxholes in several places, resulting in savage hand-to-hand fighting with knives, entrenching tools, and bare hands. "I saw Corporal Williamson kill 3 Germans with his trench knife after his rifle jammed," wrote Lieutenant Miller in his after-action report. Private First Clayton Martinez was down to his .45 pistol, using it like a club because he had no more ammunition. It was that kind of fight, primitive, desperate, no quarter asked or given. By mid-morning on December 7, the Rangers had repelled all counterattacks, but at terrible cost. Of the original 100 men who had assaulted Hill 400, fewer than 20 remained unwounded and capable of fighting. Many of the walking wounded continued to man their positions despite severe injuries. Finally, around noon on December 7, elements of the 8th Infantry Division arrived to relieve the battered Rangers. As they descended from the hill they had captured and held at such cost, the surviving Rangers carried their wounded comrades on improvised stretchers. Sergeant Fuller, one of the few officers to survive unwounded, later wrote, "I've never been prouder to be a Ranger than I was coming down that hill. We did what they said couldn't be done. We took Hill 400 and we held it, despite everything the Germans threw at us." The capture of Hill 400 represented one of the few clear-cut American victories in the Battle of the Hürtgen Forest. The position provided invaluable observation over German positions and supply routes, enabling more effective artillery fire and limiting German movement. But like so many hard-won gains in the forest, it came at a devastating human cost. The 2nd Ranger Battalion suffered over 70% casualties in just 48 hours of combat, effectively removing this elite unit from the order of battle until it could be reconstituted with replacements. And the battle for the Hürtgen Forest continued, consuming more American lives with each passing day. Private First Class Anthony DeMarco huddled in his foxhole as artillery shells exploded in the trees above him, sending deadly fragments of metal and wood raining down. It was his 5th day in the line with the 110th Infantry Regiment, and he was already a veteran in the ways of survival in the Hürtgen Forest. "Keep your head down," he cautioned the replacement who shared his hole, a fresh-faced kid from Ohio who had arrived just hours earlier. "The tree bursts are the worst. Your helmet won't stop the wooden splinters." The replacement, DeMarco hadn't even learned his name yet, nodded nervously, pressing himself deeper into the muddy hole. He was one of 12 new men who had joined the company that morning, replacing some of the many casualties from the previous week's fighting. Where, where are the Germans? The replacement whispered during a brief lull in the shelling. DeMarco gestured vaguely toward the dark forest ahead of them. Everywhere and nowhere. You won't see them until they want to be seen. This isn't like the fighting in France. Here, the forest itself is the enemy. As if to emphasize his point, a German sniper's bullet snapped through the air inches above their foxhole, followed a split second later by the distant crack of the rifle. The replacement ducked even lower, his eyes wide with fear. They've been doing that all day, DeMarco explained. Not really trying to hit us, just keeping our heads down. The real attack will come at dusk. It always does. DeMarco had entered the Hürtgen Forest with the 28th Division on November 2nd, one of 120 men in Charlie Company, 110th Infantry. After 12 days of brutal combat, the company had been reduced to just 37 effective fighters. Casualties had been horrific. Men killed or wounded by mines, machine gun fire, tree bursts, snipers, and exposure to the elements. "Stay awake," DeMarco cautioned, as he noticed the replacement's eyes beginning to close. The kid couldn't have been more than 19, and exhaustion was clearly taking its toll. Sleep in this weather, you might not wake up. The temperature had dropped below freezing, and a light snow was beginning to fall. DeMarco's uniform was caked with frozen mud. His boots, soaked from days of standing in water-filled foxholes, had caused his feet to swell and turn numb. The beginning stages of trench foot, a condition that had already claimed many of his comrades. "What's that smell?" the replacement suddenly asked, wrinkling his nose. DeMarco didn't need to ask what he meant. The sickly sweet odor of decomposition permeated the forest. "Bodies," he said simply. "Some of them have been out there for days. We can't recover them because of the snipers." The replacement looked like he might vomit. DeMarco handed him a piece of stale chocolate from his ration kit. "Eat something. It helps with the nausea." As darkness began to fall, the German artillery barrage intensified. Shells crashed through the forest canopy, exploding in the treetops and sending lethal fragments in all directions. Men shouted for medics as casualties mounted. "They're softening us up," DeMarco explained, checking his M1 rifle for the dozenth time. "The infantry attack will come soon. Remember, short bursts if you have a clear target. Ammunition is low." The replacement nodded, his hands trembling as he gripped his own rifle. They waited in tense silence as the artillery gradually shifted to targets behind them, a sure sign that the German ground assault was imminent. DeMarco strained his eyes, trying to penetrate the gathering darkness. The forest played tricks on the mind. Shadows seemed to move. Trees took on human shapes. Exhaustion and fear combined to create hallucinations that many men found more terrifying than the actual combat. "There," whispered the replacement, raising his rifle. DeMarco placed a restraining hand on the weapon. "Just a tree. Wait for a real target." Minutes later, the distinctive chatter of a German MG-42 machine gun broke the silence, its high rate of fire earning it the nickname Hitler's buzzsaw among American troops. Tracers cut through the darkness as the German gunners swept the American positions. "Stay down," DeMarco ordered as the replacement made to return fire. "They're trying to make us reveal our positions. The machine gun is just a diversion. The infiltrators will be coming from another direction." His assessment proved correct. Minutes later, dark figures emerged from the forest to their right, moving silently toward the American lines. DeMarco waited until they were within 50 yards before opening fire. His first shots dropped 2 German soldiers. The others scattered, seeking cover. The night erupted in a cacophony of gunfire as the German attack developed across the entire company front. Flares illuminated the battlefield with ghostly white light, casting long, distorted shadows among the trees. "Grenades!" someone shouted, and DeMarco heard the distinctive metallic clunk of German stick grenades landing nearby. He pressed himself into the earth as explosions shook the ground, sending dirt and fragments showering into their foxhole. When he looked up, the replacement was gone, either fled or killed. DeMarco couldn't tell in the confusion. He was alone now, one man against an unseen enemy in a dark, hostile forest. The firefight continued for over an hour before the Germans finally withdrew, taking their casualties with them. The forest fell silent except for the moans of the wounded and the occasional crack of a rifle as nervous sentries fired at imagined targets. DeMarco used the respite to check his ammunition, just 2 clips remaining for his M1 Garand. He had started the day with 6. No one knew when resupply might come. The narrow forest trails that served as supply routes were under constant German fire. As he settled back into his foxhole, now half collapsed from the artillery barrage, DeMarco thought about the replacement whose name he had never learned. Had he survived? Fled? Been captured? It didn't really matter. In the Hürtgen Forest, individual fates were swallowed by the collective horror of a battle that consumed men like fuel for a ravenous fire. Morning would bring another day of the same. Artillery, snipers, patrols, counterattacks. The grinding attrition continued without pause, day after day, reducing the once proud 28th Division to a shadow of its former self. This was the reality of the Battle of Hürtgen Forest. Not a single decisive engagement, but thousands of small, savage encounters that gradually bled the American forces white. It was a soldier's hell, where survival often seemed more a matter of chance than skill or courage. And for the men of the 28th Division, it seemed it would never end. The Kahl Trail, the narrow, muddy path that served as the main supply route for American forces attacking Schmidt and Kammerscheidt, became known to the men of the 28th Division as the Blood Trail. This name was grimly appropriate, as the trail claimed hundreds of lives during the battle for the Hürtgen Forest. Captain Gerald Morton, a medical officer with the 103rd Medical Battalion, was responsible for evacuating wounded from the forward aid station near the Kahl River back to the main field hospital in Wassenack. His daily journey along the trail became a descent into ever-deepening horror. "We started with a dozen litter teams on November 3, Morton wrote in his official report. By November 7, we were down to 3 functional teams. Men were killed or wounded carrying the wounded. The Germans had every yard of that trail zeroed for artillery and mortar fire. Snipers targeted the litter bearers specifically. The trail itself was a nightmare to navigate, even without enemy fire. Just wide enough for a jeep in most places, it descended steeply from Wassenack to the Kahl River, then climbed again toward Kammerscheidt. Heavy rains had turned much of it into a quagmire, where vehicles became hopelessly mired. "We tried using jeeps for evacuation the first day," recalled Lieutenant Robert Higgins of the 20th Engineer Combat Battalion. 3 were destroyed by mines or artillery. After that, it was litters only. 4 men carrying 1 wounded soldier over more than 2 miles of the worst terrain imaginable. The journey could take hours, with litter teams having to set down their burdens and take cover whenever enemy fire intensified. Many wounded men died during the long evacuation, their blood literally marking the trail that gave it its grim nickname. German tactics specifically targeted medical personnel and evacuation routes, a direct violation of the Geneva Convention. Medics learned to hide their Red Cross armbands, as these made them priority targets for snipers rather than offering protection. "I saw a German sniper hit 3 medics in succession as they tried to reach a wounded man," said Sergeant William Martinez. "After that, none of us wore anything that identified us as medical personnel. It was just painting a target on your back." The 28th Division's engineers worked desperately to improve the trail, filling holes, building crude bridges over the worst sections, and trying to create bypasses around areas particularly vulnerable to enemy fire. It was dangerous work, performed under constant observation from German positions on the surrounding heights. "We lost 17 men in one day, just trying to widen a section of the trail," Lieutenant Higgins reported. The Germans had pre-sighted every yard of it for artillery. They knew exactly where to hit to cause the most damage and casualties. By November 8, the trail had become virtually impassable. German infantry had infiltrated the forest on both sides, setting up ambush positions that could fire directly onto the path. Several evacuation parties were wiped out completely, the wounded and their bearers killed together. The deteriorating situation led to one of the most heart-wrenching aspects of the battle. Wounded men had to be left behind when positions were abandoned. As American forces withdrew from Kammerscheid under overwhelming German pressure, dozens of seriously wounded soldiers had to be entrusted to the care of volunteer medics who stayed behind, knowing they would be captured. "Leaving those men was the hardest thing I've ever done," Captain James Condon said during debriefing. "Some of them begged us to kill them rather than leave them for the Germans. They were that terrified. But we had no choice. We couldn't carry them out under fire." The blood trail claimed its final victims on November 10, when a last-ditch effort to evacuate wounded from the Cal River area was ambushed. Of the 24 men in the evacuation party, only 7 survived to reach American lines. The others were killed or captured, along with the wounded they were trying to save. After the battle, when the 28th Division was finally relieved by the 8th Infantry Division, engineers counted over 200 destroyed vehicles along the Cal Trail: jeeps, half-tracks, tanks, and ambulances. They were grim monuments to the futility of trying to maintain a supply line through terrain that so heavily favored the defenders. Years later, veterans of the 28th Division would return to the Hürtgen Forest and walk the route of the blood trail in remembrance of comrades lost. They found the forest had healed its scars, with new growth covering the sites of so much suffering. But for the men who fought there, the memories never faded. The mud, the cold, the constant fear, and the terrible knowledge that a wound often meant a slow death on the blood trail. The trail stands as a symbol of the larger failure of American strategy in the Hürtgen Forest, an attempt to fight on terrain that nullified American advantages and maximized German defensive capabilities. The cost in human lives was staggering and, in the assessment of many military historians, largely unnecessary. The Battle of Hürtgen Forest claimed thousands of lives, but behind the grim statistics were individual human stories, tales of courage, sacrifice, horror, and sometimes surprising humanity. These voices from the darkness provide a more personal perspective on what military historians often describe in abstract terms of strategies, objectives, and casualty figures. Private First Class Paul Whiting, 112th Infantry Regiment, wrote in a letter found in his pocket after his death on November 7th, "Dear Mom, I don't know if this will ever reach you. Things are bad here in ways I can't describe. The forest is like something from a nightmare. Men disappearing in the fog, never to be seen again. Artillery that seems to follow us wherever we go. I haven't been dry or warm in a week. Yesterday I saw Sergeant Miller step on a mine. There wasn't enough left of him to put in a helmet. Today it might be me. If I don't make it home, please know that I thought of you at the end, and that I wasn't afraid." That's a lie, actually. I am afraid. We all are. Only a fool wouldn't be in this place. Tell Dad the fishing gear in the garage is for him. Tell Sis she can have my record collection. I love you all. Whiting was killed by sniper fire while trying to evacuate a wounded comrade. He was 20 years old. Lieutenant Frank Ripperdam, 110th Infantry Regiment, kept a diary throughout the battle, writing by flashlight in foxholes and improvised shelters. His entry for November 6th reads, "Third day in the same position. Germans shell us every hour like clockwork. They're trying to break us psychologically, and it's working. Hawkins from 2nd Platoon shot himself in the foot this morning. Can't blame him. Jensen has trench foot so bad his boots had to be cut off. Doc says he might lose both feet. The worst is the waiting. Sitting in a hole filled with freezing water, not knowing if the next shell has your name on it. Some men pray, others curse. Most just stare into space with these empty eyes, like they're already dead inside." Mills got a letter saying his wife had a baby boy. He showed everyone the picture, so proud. 3 hours later, he was gone. Stepped on a shoe mine while going to relieve himself. What do I write to his wife? How do I tell her that her husband died taking a piss in a frozen forest thousands of miles from home? This war makes no sense anymore. Ripperdam survived the battle, but suffered severe combat fatigue, PTSD, and was evacuated to a field hospital on November 12th. He never returned to combat duty. Medic Walter Jensen, 103rd Medical Battalion, recorded his experiences in a report filed after the battle. Standard medical procedures became impossible in the conditions we faced. Evacuation routes were under constant fire. We performed emergency surgeries by flashlight in flooded foxholes. Wounded men who might have been saved died because we couldn't reach them in time or get them to proper facilities. I performed an amputation using a K-bar knife sterilized in alcohol from a flask. The patient, a sergeant from the 112th, bit through a leather belt rather than scream and reveal our position to German patrols. He thanked me afterward, thanked me for cutting off his leg without anesthesia. We ran out of plasma on the fourth day, used coffee when we ran out of IV fluids, tore up shirts for bandages. By the end, we were treating sucking chest wounds with cellophane from cigarette packages and sealing them with chewing gum. And still they kept coming. Men with wounds I'd never imagined possible, asking if they were going to die, asking us to write letters to their families. I don't sleep anymore without seeing their faces. From the German side, Oberleutnant Friedrich Lengfeld left one of the most moving testimonies of humanity amid the horror. Lengfeld commanded a company of the 275th Infantry Division, defending the area around the Wild Pig minefield. On November 10, an American soldier became stranded in the minefield, severely wounded. His cries for help could be heard by both German and American positions. After several hours, with no American rescue attempt forthcoming, Lengfeld decided to act. According to the testimony of Hubert Gies, a rifleman under Lengfeld's command, the Oberleutnant told me to inform our machine gun crews not to fire if the Americans came to rescue their comrade. But no one came. The Americans' cries grew weaker as the day passed. Finally, Lengfeld could bear it no longer. He gathered a small team of men, saying, "We're going to get him." He led the way into the minefield, following a path he believed was safe. He had gone perhaps 10 meters when there was an explosion. The Oberleutnant was thrown into the air, landing hard on his back. There were 2 deep wounds in his back from mine fragments. We carried him to the aid station, but he died that evening from his injuries. His last words were to ask if we had rescued the American. We had not. Both men died in that field. I don't know who the American was, but Lengfeld died trying to save his enemy. This, to me, was the greatest courage I witnessed in the war. In 1994, a monument to Oberleutnant Lengfeld was erected in the Hürtgen Forest by American veterans of the 4th Infantry Division, bearing the inscription, "Here in the Hürtgen Forest on November 12, 1944, Lieutenant Friedrich Lengfeld, a German officer, gave his life while trying to save the life of an American soldier lying severely wounded in the Wild Sow minefield. This memorial is erected in gratitude to our former enemy for his humanity." These individual stories, multiplied thousands of times, form the true narrative of the Battle of Hürtgen Forest. Not just a military engagement, but a profound human tragedy that left scars on all who experienced it, regardless of which side they fought for. The 28th Infantry Division entered the Hürtgen Forest wearing their distinctive red, keystone-shaped shoulder patches, a symbol of pride that identified them as Pennsylvania National Guardsmen. They emerged with a new, grimmer nickname bestowed by their German adversaries, the Bloody Bucket Division. This macabre designation was a reference to the shape of their patch, which German soldiers thought resembled a bucket now filled with the blood of thousands of American casualties. The name was grimly appropriate, given the division's devastating losses. Major General Norman Dutch Coda, the division's commander, had to report the full extent of these losses to 5th Corps headquarters on November 19, 1944, after the division was finally relieved by elements of the 8th Infantry Division. His official after-action report laid bare the catastrophic human cost of the 2-week battle. The 28th Infantry Division entered the Hürtgen Forest operation on November 2, 1944, with a total effective strength of 14,253 personnel. Upon relief on November 19, 1944, the division's effective strength was 8,067 personnel. Total casualties were 6,184, broken down as follows. Killed in action, 931. Wounded in action, 2,683. Missing in action, 1,803. Non-battle casualties, exposure, trench foot, combat fatigue, 767. Material losses include 16 M10 tank destroyers, 31 M4 Sherman medium tanks, and approximately 80% of crew-served weapons, machine guns, mortars, etc. In exchange for these losses, the division advanced a maximum of 3,000 yards on the central axis, temporarily occupied the town of Schmidt for less than 24 hours, and inflicted estimated casualties of 2,000 killed, 913 captured, and 15 tanks destroyed on the enemy. It is the assessment of this headquarters that the division is no longer combat effective and will require extensive reconstitution before being committed to further offensive operations. Behind the clinical language of the report lay the human reality. Nearly half of the division had become casualties in just 2 weeks of combat. Entire companies had been effectively destroyed. The 112th Infantry Regiment, which had borne the brunt of the fighting around Schmidt and Kammerscheid, had lost over 60% of its fighting strength. The psychological impact was as severe as the physical. Combat fatigue cases, what would now be recognized as acute combat stress reaction and post-traumatic stress disorder, skyrocketed during the Forest battle. Men who had fought bravely through Normandy and across France broke down under the constant strain of the Hürtgen fighting. I had veteran sergeants, men who had been in combat since D-Day, sitting in foxholes crying uncontrollably, reported Captain Robert Gaynor. Others simply stopped functioning. They wouldn't speak, wouldn't respond to orders, just stared into space. The combination of the terrain, the weather, and the type of fighting broke something in them. The division's medical personnel were overwhelmed not just by combat wounds, but by environmental casualties. Trench foot and immersion foot, painful conditions caused by prolonged exposure to cold, wet conditions, affected hundreds of men. Pneumonia and other respiratory infections spread rapidly among troops living in water-filled foxholes in freezing temperatures. We were losing as many men to the elements as to enemy fire, noted Captain Gerald Morton of the 103rd Medical Battalion. Men whose feet had turned black from trench foot. Men with temperatures of 104 degrees from pneumonia. Men who were physically intact but mentally shattered by what they had experienced. The 28th Division was withdrawn to Luxembourg to rest, receive replacements, and retrain. But they would have precious little time to recover. Less than a month later, on December 16, 1944, they would find themselves directly in the path of the massive German offensive that opened the Battle of the Bulge. Still under strength and with many veterans replaced by green troops, the division would once again find itself fighting for survival against overwhelming odds, a testament to the relentless demands placed on American combat units during the final months of World War II. The Bloody Bucket designation followed the division, a grim reminder of their sacrifice in the dark forest. Years later, veterans would wear the nickname as a badge of honor, a recognition of what they had endured and survived when so many of their comrades had fallen. But for many, the psychological scars of the Hürtgen Forest never healed. Nightmares, flashbacks, and what would now be diagnosed as PTSD plagued survivors for decades after the war. The forest had claimed not just lives but minds and spirits, leaving wounds that never fully closed. As one veteran put it decades later, "I left part of myself in those woods. The man who came out wasn't the same one who went in. None of us were." February 10, 1945. The Battle of Hürtgen Forest officially ended when American forces finally secured the Rohr River dams, the strategic objective that had ostensibly justified the months-long campaign. The final cost was staggering. Approximately 33,000 American casualties, killed, wounded, captured, or incapacitated by combat exhaustion and exposure, and an estimated 28,000 German casualties. The 28th Infantry Division's losses, 6,184 casualties, were among the highest of any division involved. The battle had consumed multiple American divisions. After the 28th was withdrawn in mid-November, the 8th Infantry Division took its place, followed by the 4th Infantry Division. Both suffered similarly devastating casualties for minimal territorial gains. Elements of the 1st, 9th, and 78th Infantry Divisions, along with the 5th Armored Division, were also fed into the forest battle, piece by piece. Military historians would later question the entire strategic rationale for the battle. The Hürtgen Forest could have been contained and bypassed rather than assaulted frontally. The critical Roer River dams could have been approached from another direction, avoiding the nightmare of forest fighting entirely. Colonel James Gavin, who commanded the 82nd Airborne Division during the war, though not in the Hürtgen Forest, later wrote, "For us, the Hürtgen was one of the most costly, most unproductive, and most ill-advised battles that our army has ever fought. But for the men who fought there, such strategic considerations meant little. They had endured a very personal hell, fighting not for grand objectives, but for their own survival and the lives of their comrades." After the war, the Hürtgen Forest gradually healed its physical scars. New trees grew where artillery had shattered the forest canopy. Underbrush covered the shell craters and collapsed bunkers. Nature reclaimed the battlefield. Yet traces remained for those who knew where to look. German bunkers, too solidly built to be easily demolished, still dotted the forest. Rusty remnants of equipment, helmets, canteens, ammunition boxes, could occasionally be found half buried in the forest floor. And for decades after the war, the forest continued to yield its most deadly legacy: unexploded ordnance and mines that claimed occasional victims among hikers and forestry workers. For the survivors, the mental scars proved more lasting than the physical ones. Many veterans of the battle refused to speak of their experiences for decades, unable or unwilling to revisit the horror they had endured. Private First Class Anthony DeMarco, one of the few men in his company to survive the battle, didn't speak about Hürtgen for over 40 years. When he finally broke his silence at a division reunion in 1986, he explained, "There are no words for what it was like. How do you describe hell to someone who hasn't been there? Better to say nothing than to say something that can't possibly convey the reality." Lieutenant Frank Ripperdam, whose diary provided one of the most detailed first-hand accounts of the battle, suffered from severe PTSD for the rest of his life. "I never really left that forest," he told an interviewer shortly before his death in 1992. "Part of me is still there, in that cold, dark place, waiting for the next artillery barrage or the next mine to explode." The battle's obscurity in popular memory stands in stark contrast to its enormous human cost. While D-Day, the Battle of the Bulge, and the crossing of the Rhine have been immortalized in films and books, the Hürtgen Forest remains largely forgotten, except by those who fought there and military historians. Perhaps this is because the battle fits poorly into the triumphant narrative of World War II. There were few heroic advances or decisive victories in the Hürtgen, only a grinding, attritional struggle that consumed men and material with little visible result. Or perhaps it is because the battle represented a clear strategic mistake by American leadership, a frontal assault into terrain that heavily favored the defenders, persisted in long after its futility should have been apparent. For whatever reason, the Battle of Hürtgen Forest remained in the shadows of history, much as it was fought in the literal shadows of the dense German forest. In 1962, a small monument was erected near the village of Vossenack to commemorate the Americans who died in the battle. The inscription reads simply, "In memory of the soldiers of the United States Army who fought and died in the Hürtgen Forest." Every year on the anniversary of the battle, a small ceremony is held there. Fewer and fewer veterans attend as time claims those who survived the forest. But local German residents continue the tradition, laying wreaths and maintaining the memorial, a recognition that the suffering of the battle transcended national boundaries. In the forest itself, the wind still whispers through the trees, carrying echoes of a time when this peaceful woodland became a place of unprecedented horror for thousands of young men far from home. The shadows still fall heavily among the tall firs, as they did when men fought and died in their darkness. For those who know its history, the Hürtgen Forest stands as a solemn reminder of the true cost of war, not measured in territory gained or strategic objectives achieved, but in the individual human lives forever altered or extinguished in its dark embrace. Today, the Hürtgen Forest bears few visible scars of the savage battle that raged there from September to December 1944. The trees have regrown, covering shell craters and battlefields with new growth. Nature has reclaimed what was once contested inch by bloody inch. Visitors to the area find a peaceful woodland region in the North Eifel, popular with hikers and nature enthusiasts. The villages that were reduced to rubble, Schmidt, Kammerscheid, Wassenack, Hürtgen, have been rebuilt, their pre-war charm restored. Yet reminders of the past remain for those who know where to look. Concrete bunkers of the Siegfried Line still dot the landscape, too massive to be easily removed. Small memorials mark significant sites of the battle. Museums in Hürtgen and Wassenack preserve artifacts and tell the stories of what happened there. The most poignant reminders are the military cemeteries. The Hürtgen War Cemetery contains the graves of 3,001 German soldiers. In the Wassenack German War Cemetery rest another 2,347 German dead. And at Henri Chapelle American Cemetery in nearby Belgium, 7,992 American soldiers are buried, many of them casualties of the Hürtgen Forest battle. Military historians continue to study the battle, generally viewing it as a strategic failure that should have been avoided. The forest could have been contained and bypassed. The critical Rohr River dams could have been approached from another direction, avoiding the nightmare of forest fighting entirely. Former enemies have become friends. Veterans from both sides have met in reconciliation, sharing the bond of having survived an ordeal few others could comprehend. In 1994, American veterans of the 4th Infantry Division erected a monument to Oberleutnant Friedrich Lengfeld, the German officer who died trying to rescue a wounded American soldier in the Wild Pig minefield. For the survivors, the memories never faded. The men of the 28th Infantry Division who emerged from the forest, less than 2/3 of those who entered, carried the experience with them for the rest of their lives. Sergeant William Martinez, who survived the Wild Pig minefield only to be severely wounded in the Battle of the Bulge a month later, spoke for many when he said in a 2001 interview, "Not a day goes by that I don't think about the forest. I see the faces of men who never made it out. I hear the sounds, the screams, the explosions, the splintering trees. It's like a movie that plays in my head that I can't turn off." Lieutenant Colonel Carl Peterson, who commanded the 1st Battalion, 112th Infantry during the battle, refused to discuss his experiences until shortly before his death in 1989. When he finally broke his silence, he said simply, "It should never have happened. So many good men lost for nothing. That's the real tragedy of Hürtgen. Not just that men died, but that they died unnecessarily." The Battle of Hürtgen Forest stands as a stark reminder of the human cost of strategic miscalculation in warfare. It was a battle where the fundamental military principle of not fighting on ground that favors the enemy was ignored, with catastrophic consequences. But beyond the strategic lessons, the battle remains primarily a human story, a testament to both the depths of suffering men can endure and the heights of courage they can display in the most desperate circumstances. The men who fought in the dark forest faced not just a human enemy, but the combined hostility of terrain, weather, and environment. They endured conditions that tested the limits of human endurance. Many broke under the strain. Many more died. Those who survived emerged forever changed. In the peaceful forest that exists today, their echoes remain, a distant reminder of sacrifice and suffering, largely forgotten by the wider world, but never by those who were there. The dark forest keeps its secrets, and the wind whispers through the trees. Thank you for listening. If you are also proud of the bravery of our soldiers, subscribe to our channel so you don't miss out on new historical stories.